At 6:40, the west nursery corridor should have been empty, yet a small wooden toy carriage lay in the center of the polished floor, one wheel cracked as if stepped on in haste. The royal guard on duty stopped. The nursery door ahead stood slightly open, though it had been logged closed minutes earlier. He felt the quiet shift of something wrong. The inner residence wing followed a rhythm so predictable that even small deviations carried weight, and that morning the change first appeared as silence. Royal Guard Daniel Mercer slowed his pace as he entered the nursery corridor, the polished floor reflecting the pale winter light filtering through high frosted windows. At that hour there was usually quiet movement, soft steps of attendants, the distant murmur of voices, the faint clatter of breakfast trays being cleared. But now the air felt still, as if sound itself had withdrawn. Mercer paused beside the duty console recessed into the wall and glanced at the corridor activity display, a routine habit more than a necessity, and noticed the timeline marker showing a discontinuity, a 6-minute interval with no recorded movement, no camera annotation, nothing. The system did not produce gaps. He leaned closer, scanning the log again, tracing the minute marks with his finger as if the numbers might rearrange themselves, but the absence remained, precise and unmistakable. A door opened quietly at the far end of the corridor, and one of the junior attendants stepped out carrying folded linens. She froze for a fraction of a second when she saw Mercer watching, then resumed walking with deliberate calm, eyes lowered, her knuckles pale against the fabric she carried. Mercer noted the reaction without comment, continuing toward the nursery suite, his boots making almost no sound on the thick runner laid along the corridor's center. As he approached, he became aware of subdued voices inside the antechamber, not the light, reassuring tone normally used around a child, but something tighter, controlled, as though each word were being weighed before being spoken. He stopped just short of the partially open door, listening, not to eavesdrop, but to orient himself, to understand the atmosphere before stepping in. Someone inside said quietly, "He hasn't said anything yet," and another voice answered, "We should wait." Mercer pushed the door open and entered, his expression neutral, posture formal, every movement measured. The nursery sitting room was orderly but tense. 2 attendants stood near the hearth, though no fire had been lit. A nurse knelt beside a low chair, and Prince Louis sat there, small hands resting motionless in his lap, eyes fixed on the carpet, as if studying its pattern with unusual intensity. The child's face was pale, not with illness, but with withdrawal, and the stillness around him felt fragile, as though any sudden sound might cause it to fracture. Mercer inclined his head slightly to the staff. "Is everything in order?" he asked, his voice calm, carrying neither suspicion nor reassurance. The nurse answered that the prince had stumbled earlier and become upset. Nothing serious, only a moment of distress, yet her voice lacked conviction, and no one else spoke. Mercer's gaze moved quietly around the room, noting the position of a small overturned footstool near the writing table, the faint scuff on the polished floor beside it, and a glass of water untouched on a side tray, condensation still beading along its rim. Nothing dramatic, nothing overtly alarming, only small elements that did not align. He felt the familiar pressure of protocol guiding him toward a routine entry in the log, a brief notation, a closed incident. Yet the missing 6 minutes in the corridor record lingered in his mind, and as he looked at the silent child, Mercer sensed that the stillness in the room was not the calm that follows a minor accident, but the quiet that follows something no one wishes to describe, and he realized he did not yet know what had truly happened. Mercer requested, with quiet politeness, that the attendants step into the adjoining preparation room for a moment, framing it as a need to verify corridor timing and housekeeping schedules, a mundane pretext that drew no immediate objection. The nurse hesitated, glancing once toward the prince, then rose and followed the others, leaving the door slightly ajar. The room settled into a deeper silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the carriage clock on the mantel and the distant hum of ventilation through the old stone walls. Mercer remained standing at a respectful distance, careful not to loom, and after a few seconds he spoke softly, asking the prince if he was hurt anywhere. The child did not answer, but shifted slightly, drawing one foot back against the chair leg, a small defensive movement that Mercer noticed but did not comment on. He crouched to bring himself closer to the child's eye level, not as a gesture of familiarity, but to reduce the formality that sometimes made young royals retreat further into silence. In the quiet, Mercer became aware of another detail, a faint, irregular mark on the cuff of the prince's sleeve, not large enough to be called a stain, but dark enough to draw attention. He did not reach for it, he simply observed, allowing the seconds to pass without pressing the child to speak. Eventually, footsteps approached in the outer room, and the senior house steward entered, his expression composed but guarded, informing Mercer that the situation had already been assessed and recorded as a minor fall, no further inquiry required. Mercer rose slowly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, and asked to see the written entry for the hour in question. The steward hesitated almost incomprehensibly before handing over the tablet. Mercer read in silence, a brief line, noting a disturbance at 9:14, staff response at 9:16, child calmed by 9:18. The times were precise, orderly, and incompatible with the corridor log showing no recorded movement until 9:20. When Mercer looked up, the steward was watching him closely, the polite stillness of his posture carrying an undercurrent of expectation, as though waiting for Mercer to accept the explanation and close the matter. Instead, Mercer returned the tablet and said evenly that he would need to verify the corridor recordings and maintenance reports before finalizing the entry. The steward replied, still courteous, that such steps were unnecessary and might create confusion in routine documentation. The exchange remained calm, professional, yet the pressure within it was unmistakable, a subtle but firm boundary being drawn. Mercer inclined his head, acknowledging the steward's position, but he did not withdraw the request. As he stepped back into the corridor, the silence felt different now, not empty, but watchful. He moved to the wall console again and initiated a review of the surveillance archive, his reflection faint in the glass as the timeline began to load. The 6-minute gap remained, stark and unaccounted for, and as Mercer stood there, listening to the distant muffled sounds of the residence continuing its morning routine, he understood that whatever had happened inside that room had not been accidental, and that the effort to close the matter quickly had begun almost immediately. The realization settled over him with a quiet, steady weight, and for the first time that morning he felt the distinct, unwelcome awareness that continuing to look into those missing minutes might place him in direct conflict with people whose authority he was sworn to obey.
By late morning, the residence had returned outwardly to its normal cadence, but Daniel Mercer felt the underlying tension in the subtle ways corridors emptied when he approached and in the restrained politeness of staff who normally spoke with easy familiarity. He spent the next hour in the security office adjoining the inner wing, reviewing maintenance reports, cross-checking camera diagnostics, and examining corridor logs line by line. The 6-minute absence remained unexplained. No technical fault had been reported, and no scheduled maintenance overlapped the interval. Shortly before midday, Mercer was summoned to the Household Administration Chamber, a narrow, wood-paneled room where the senior house steward and the deputy private secretary were waiting. Both men greeted him courteously, their tone measured, their expressions neutral, yet the formality of the setting signaled that this was not a routine discussion. The steward spoke first, explaining that the incident in the nursery had been evaluated by medical staff and determined to be minor, that the prince had stumbled while moving a footstool and become briefly distressed, and that the matter was considered closed. Mercer listened without interruption, hands resting loosely at his sides, his face composed, but he noticed that neither man mentioned the missing surveillance record or the conflicting times in the log. When the steward finished, Mercer replied that he was unable to finalize the report while the corridor recording remained incomplete, and that standard procedure required clarification of any unexplained gap in monitored areas, particularly those adjoining the royal nursery. The deputy secretary leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firmer, stating that the household preferred to avoid unnecessary documentation that might be misinterpreted or circulated beyond its proper context, and that Mercer's duty in this instance was to record the explanation already provided. The words were careful, not overtly directive, yet the meaning was clear. The matter was to be concluded without further inquiry. Mercer felt the familiar internal division that every experienced guard eventually encountered, the quiet conflict between the precision of written protocol and the instinct that arose from observation and experience. Protocol provided order, prevented chaos, and protected the institution he served, but instinct warned him that an incomplete record in a protected corridor was not a trivial matter, especially when a child had been found silent and withdrawn in its aftermath. He asked, as evenly as he could, whether a maintenance review had been requested for the camera interruption. The steward replied that it had not been deemed necessary. The conversation paused, the silence lengthening just enough to carry weight, and Mercer understood that continuing to press the matter in that room would be interpreted not as diligence but as resistance. He inclined his head, acknowledging the explanation without agreeing to it, and accepted the preliminary incident file handed to him. As he left the chamber, the corridor outside felt unusually cold, the stone walls holding the winter air, and he walked slowly back toward the security office, aware that the decision before him was no longer procedural, but personal. Whether to sign the report as written, closing the incident and preserving the smooth operation of the household, or to continue examining the discrepancies, knowing that doing so would place him in quiet opposition to those responsible for the residence's daily order. He set the file on the desk and looked at the blank space at the bottom of the report, the frame of the space seeming larger than the page itself, and he realized that whichever course he chose would shape everything that followed. Mercer did not sign the report that afternoon. Instead, he began reconstructing the timeline from fragments that lay outside the official record, moving carefully, methodically, as though each step had to justify itself before the next could be taken. He spoke first with the technical officer responsible for corridor systems, framing his questions as routine verification. The officer confirmed that no faults or resets had been logged on the camera network during the morning, and that any outage of 40 seconds or more would normally trigger an automatic alert. Mercer noted the statement without comment, recording the time and the exact wording in his notebook, aware that small details often became decisive later. Then he reviewed the physical environment of the nursery sitting room again, this time with deliberate attention to minor disturbances, the footstool's position relative to the scuff on the floor, the angle of the writing table chair, the placement of a decorative tray whose contents had been shifted just enough to suggest it had been handled hurriedly. None of these details proved anything on their own, yet together they formed a pattern inconsistent with a simple fall. In the corridor outside, he paused near the wall panel where attendants logged routine entries and noticed that one line in the morning register had been written over, the original notation faintly visible beneath the correction. He did not attempt to expose it. Instead, he photographed the page discreetly with his issued device, preserving the evidence without altering the record. The deeper he looked, the more he felt the quiet pressure building around him, not direct interference, but the subtle awareness that his movements were being observed, that conversations paused when he entered a room, that questions were answered carefully rather than candidly. Late in the afternoon, he was approached by the deputy secretary again, who inquired, with polite concern, whether Mercer had completed the incident documentation. Mercer replied that verification was still in progress. The secretary's expression remained courteous, but his tone cooled slightly as he reminded Mercer that prolonged inquiries into minor household matters could disrupt the residence's functioning and reflect poorly on those involved. Mercer acknowledged the statement and continued his work, but the exchange made the stakes unmistakable. Persistence would not be welcomed. As evening approached, the nursery wing grew quieter, the soft lighting along the corridor casting long reflections across the polished floor, and Mercer stood alone at the surveillance console, reviewing archived footage frame by frame. The cameras covering the private corridor adjacent to the nursery showed routine movement, attendants passing, a nurse carrying linens, a footman adjusting a wall sconce, and then the feed skipped forward, the timestamp advancing by exactly 40 seconds. The transition was clean, too clean for a malfunction, as though a segment had been deliberately removed rather than lost. Mercer leaned back slightly, listening to the faint hum of the equipment, and felt the weight of what he was uncovering settle into certainty. Someone with access and authority had interfered with the record. He understood then that the question before him was no longer whether an irregularity had occurred, but whether he was prepared to pursue it beyond the limits that had been quietly placed in his path, knowing that doing so might challenge individuals far above his rank and place his own position and perhaps his career at risk.
Daniel Mercer began the next morning earlier than his assigned shift, arriving while the eastern sky was still gray and the residence lay in that narrow interval between night watch and morning service when corridors were quiet and movements were few. The reduced activity allowed him to review restricted surveillance channels without interruption, and he used his authorization to access the archive for the private corridor that connected the nursery suite to a smaller receiving passage, seldom used except by senior household members. The footage from the previous day appeared ordinary at first: a maid troussing with folded towels, a footman adjusting a curtain, the slow passage of time measured in steady seconds. Mercer watched patiently, noting timestamps and movements in a small notebook, allowing the recording to play at normal speed rather than skipping ahead, because experience had taught him that anomalies often revealed themselves in rhythm rather than in isolated frames. At 09:12, the corridor was empty. At 09:13, a figure entered from the south end, Camilla, moving with deliberate steps, her posture composed, but her pace slightly faster than the unhurried walk customary in that wing. Mercer leaned closer to the monitor, studying the details. Her hand carried no documents or personal items, and she did not pause near the decorative console table where visitors often stopped briefly, but continued directly toward the nursery access door, disappearing from view. The corridor remained empty for nearly 2 minutes. Then, at 09:15, she reappeared, emerging from the same door, her movement more abrupt than before, one hand briefly touching the wall as if steadying herself before continuing down the corridor and out of frame. Mercer replayed the sequence several times, observing the small, almost imperceptible signs of tension in her movements, the tightened shoulders, the quickened pace, the absence of the measured composure expected in such a setting. At 09:16, the corridor camera feed froze for less than a second, then resumed, but the timestamp advanced abruptly, skipping forward 40 seconds. Mercer marked the exact frame where the discontinuity occurred and cross-checked it against the central system log. No alert or maintenance flag accompanied the interruption. He sat back, listening to the faint hum of the equipment and the distant echo of footsteps from another wing, and considered what he was seeing. A senior royal leaving the nursery area shortly before a documented disturbance, followed by an unreported outage in the surveillance record, constituted not proof of wrongdoing, but a convergence of facts that demanded careful handling. Accusations based on incomplete evidence could cause damage not only to individuals, but to the stability of the household itself. Yet ignoring such convergence would contradict the very purpose of the guard's duty. Mercer printed a still image of the timestamp and secured it in a sealed evidence envelope, labeling it only with the date and corridor designation, avoiding any interpretation in writing. As he stood, he became aware of the silence in the security room, the sense that he had crossed an invisible threshold, from observing an irregularity to possessing information that, if pursued, could alter the balance of authority within the residence. Mercer understood that evidence was not enough. It had to be corroborated, contextualized, and preserved in a way that could withstand scrutiny from those accustomed to challenging every detail. He spent the remainder of the morning reconstructing movements in adjacent corridors, tracing the paths of attendants and staff to determine who might have been near the nursery during the missing interval. The pattern that emerged was subtle but significant. 2 attendants scheduled for routine cleaning had been reassigned to another floor at the last moment, leaving the corridor unusually empty during that period, a change authorized verbally rather than entered into the scheduling system. When Mercer inquired about the reassignment, the supervisor answered that the instruction had come from a senior office but could not specify which one. The explanation was plausible, yet the absence of documentation added another small inconsistency to the growing pattern. By early afternoon, Mercer had compiled a concise file, still images from the surveillance record, maintenance logs confirming no reported faults, and notes from staff interviews recorded in neutral language. He avoided speculation, limiting the file strictly to verifiable facts, because he knew that any hint of conjecture would allow the entire matter to be dismissed. As he organized the documents, he felt the quiet strain of awareness that his work, though conducted within the bounds of duty, was moving into territory where rank and protocol intertwined in complex ways. Accusing or even implicating a senior royal required not only evidence but the careful judgment of when and how to present it, and the margin for error was narrow. Late in the day, as Mercer prepared to secure the file in the restricted archive, the senior house steward entered the security office without prior notice, his expression composed, his tone courteous, asking in a conversational manner whether Mercer had completed his review of the nursery incident. Mercer replied that he was still verifying timelines and certain discrepancies required clarification before the report could be finalized. The steward listened without interruption, then remarked that prolonged investigations into sensitive household matters could easily be misunderstood, and discretion in such cases was often the greater service to the Crown. Mercer inclined his head, acknowledging the remark, but did not volunteer the extent of his findings. After the steward departed, the room felt quieter than before, the air carrying a faint tension that lingered even after the sound of footsteps had faded. Mercer secured the evidence file in a locked drawer and remained seated for several minutes, considering his next step. The information he possessed was not yet sufficient to present as a formal accusation, but it was enough to justify a confidential briefing at the highest level, bypassing the layers of administration that had already shown reluctance to pursue the matter. The decision to request such an audience would be extraordinary for a guard of his rank, and once made, it could not be withdrawn without consequence. As evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard outside the narrow window, Mercer realized that the path ahead required not only precision, but resolve, and that by morning he would have to decide whether to carry the evidence forward to the one authority capable of acting upon it. Daniel Mercer submitted the direct briefing just after dawn, routing it through the formal security channel reserved for matters involving potential risk to a member of the royal household. The form required precise language and minimal interpretation, and Mercer completed it with deliberate care, listing only verifiable facts: an unreported surveillance interruption, discrepancies in incident logs, and observable distress in a minor under royal protection. He avoided conclusions, knowing that the weight of such a request lay not in accusation, but in the clarity of its documentation. Once transmitted, the request could not be quietly withdrawn, and Mercer spent the next several hours carrying out routine duties while waiting for a response, the ordinary rhythm of the residents continuing around him: footsteps on polished stone, the muted ringing of service bells, the distant murmur of conversation drifting through high-ceilinged corridors. Shortly after midday, a message arrived instructing him to report to a private council chamber in the administrative wing at 1400 hours. The chamber was seldom used except for confidential briefings, and when Mercer entered, he found only a single aide present, who directed him to wait. The room was cool, lit by tall windows that admitted a pale winter light, and the silence within it felt deliberate, as though designed to encourage precision of thought. Mercer placed his sealed evidence folder on the table and stood beside it, reviewing in his mind the sequence of events, ensuring that every statement he would make could be supported by documented fact. When the door opened again, King Charles entered, accompanied by a single private secretary, and Mercer straightened to attention, offering a formal salute before being instructed, with a quiet gesture, to speak freely. The king's manner was composed, attentive rather than imposing, and Mercer began his report in a calm, measured voice, reconstructing the timeline step by step: the missing 6 minutes in the corridor log, the absence of any maintenance report, the conflicting incident entry, and the surveillance sequence showing movement in the private corridor, followed by an unexplained outage. He presented each document in order, allowing the king to examine them without interruption, answering questions briefly and precisely when asked. The atmosphere in the chamber remained still, the only sound the faint rustle of paper and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the paneled wall. When Mercer finished, the king remained silent for several seconds, his gaze resting on the final photograph of the surveillance timestamp, and the weight of that silence felt heavier than any immediate response could have been. The king asked a small number of questions, each directed toward clarification rather than interpretation: whether any technical fault could account for the interruption, whether staff movements during the interval had been fully traced, whether the child had shown signs of physical injury beyond distress. Mercer answered carefully, stating only what he had observed or verified, resisting any temptation to speculate on motives or responsibility. The discipline of that restraint steadied him, allowing the facts themselves to carry their weight. After the final question, the king closed the folder and rested his hand upon it for a moment, as if considering not only the information, but the consequences of acting upon it. Then he instructed the private secretary to arrange an immediate internal inquiry under restricted authority, with all surveillance archives secured and access to the nursery wing temporarily limited to essential personnel only. The order was delivered quietly, without emphasis, yet its significance was unmistakable. The matter had moved beyond household administration into direct royal oversight. Mercer felt neither relief nor triumph, only a sober awareness that the process he had set in motion would now unfold beyond his control. Before dismissing him, the king looked at Mercer and said simply that the duty of a guard extended not only to the defense of the crown, but to the protection of those within it who could not defend themselves, and that such duty sometimes required difficult judgment. The words were spoken without ceremony, almost as a reflection rather than an instruction, and Mercer inclined his head in acknowledgment before taking his leave. Outside the chamber, the corridor seemed brighter than before, the late afternoon light reflecting from the marble floor, yet the atmosphere of the residence had begun to shift in subtle ways. Security personnel moved with increased purpose, access doors were quietly reassigned to restricted status, and small groups of officials conferred in low voices. By evening, investigators from the Palace Legal Office had arrived, and Mercer provided them with copies of his documentation, answering their questions with the same careful precision he had used in the briefing. As night settled over the residence, the nursery wing remained under discreet guard, the corridors quieter than usual, and Mercer stood his post at the junction leading to the restricted area, aware that the events of the past 2 days had altered the course of many lives, including his own, and that the final resolution of the matter had not yet come.
The inquiry advanced with deliberate quietness, its progress visible only in subtle shifts within the residence. Investigators from the Palace Legal Office worked in small teams, moving through corridors at measured intervals, reviewing access logs, interviewing staff, and restoring damaged surveillance files with assistance from technical specialists. Daniel Mercer remained assigned to the nursery wing, his duties outwardly unchanged, yet the atmosphere around his post carried a new gravity. Access to the corridor was restricted to a short list of authorized personnel, and each entry required written acknowledgement, a process that slowed movement and heightened awareness of every footstep and voice. The prince had been moved temporarily to a smaller suite under medical supervision, and Mercer occasionally saw him pass, accompanied by a nurse, the child quieter than before, but no longer withdrawn into the stillness Mercer had first observed. The improvement was slight, but it was enough to confirm that whatever had caused the earlier distress had not been imagined. Late one afternoon, Mercer was summoned to the security office, where the lead investigator, a composed woman with a precise manner of speaking, informed him that the restored footage from the private corridor had revealed the full 40-second sequence previously missing. Mercer watched the recording in silence. The images showed a brief but unmistakable exchange in the nursery antechamber, raised voices, the child stepping back, an abrupt movement that sent the footstool overturning, and a moment of visible fear before attendants entered and the recording ended. The sequence was not dramatic, not violent in the way that drew immediate attention, yet its significance lay in what it demonstrated, an interaction inconsistent with the explanation recorded in the incident log and indicative of conduct that placed the child under emotional strain. The investigator paused the footage and explained that corroborating statements from 2 attendants, given separately, aligned with the timeline and described behavior that had been reported informally before, but never documented formally, largely because of the seniority of the individual involved. Mercer listened without speaking, feeling the quiet confirmation of what he had suspected from the beginning. The investigator then informed him that the evidence had been presented to the king that morning, and that a decision was expected before nightfall.
When Mercer returned to his post, the air in the corridor felt unusually still, the fading daylight casting long, pale reflections along the floor, and he found himself listening more intently than usual to the distant sounds of the residents, aware that the next development would likely arrive without warning. The order came shortly after dusk. Mercer was summoned again to the security office, where the commander of the guard handed him a sealed directive bearing the royal seal. The instructions were concise. Legal authorities operating under palace jurisdiction were authorized to detain the individual identified in the inquiry, and Mercer was to assist in securing the corridor and ensuring that the process proceeded without disturbance. There was no rhetoric in the wording, no expression of anger or reproach, only the formal language of procedure, carrying the weight of final authority. Mercer acknowledged the order and returned to the designated corridor, where a small group of officers from the legal office and palace security assembled, their movements quiet, their expressions composed. The detention itself was conducted with the same restraint that governed every other aspect of palace life, a brief statement of authority, a request to accompany the officers, and a departure through a private passage that avoided the main corridors. There was no raised voice, no visible struggle, only the subdued tension of a moment that would later be recorded in official reports, but rarely spoken of openly. When it was over, the corridor settled again into silence, the heavy door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to linger in the air. Mercer remained at his post, as assigned, watching the intersection where the lamplight met the shadows, and allowed himself a moment to reflect on the path that had led there, from the faint irregularity in a corridor log to the quiet execution of a royal order. He understood that loyalty to the crown was often spoken of in terms of ceremony and defense, yet in practice it was measured in quieter decisions, noticing what others overlooked, asking questions when silence would be easier, and accepting the consequences of acting when inaction would be safer. Somewhere down the corridor he heard the distant, ordinary sounds of the residents continuing, footsteps, the closing of a door, the muted murmur of voices, and he realized that the life of the palace, like the duty of those who guarded it, moved forward not in grand gestures, but in the steady, disciplined rhythm of small, necessary acts.